Shame whispers in the quiet moments when you are most vulnerable, when you are tired, when you have failed, or when you compare yourself to others. It doesn't shout or confront you directly. Instead, it settles into the background of your thoughts like a constant hum that says you are not enough. This voice becomes so familiar that many people mistake it for truth. They start believing that their worth is measured by perfection, success, or approval from others. The painful reality is that shame thrives where silence lives, feeding on the idea that if you hide your flaws, you might still deserve love. This whisper of shame often begins early in life, planted in moments where mistakes were met with harsh judgment instead of understanding. Over time, the voice grows, and it becomes the filter through which you see yourself. Every rejection, every failure, every missed opportunity is not just an event, it becomes proof of your supposed inadequacy. That's why shame is so insidious. It ties your self-worth to your struggles and convinces you that your identity is defined by what went wrong. It is not a loud critic. It is the constant echo of self-doubt in your own mind. When shame tells you that you're not enough, it also convinces you to hide. You hide your mistakes, your emotions, and even your authentic self because you fear that exposure will lead to rejection. You learn to cover up with perfectionism, people-pleasing, or silence. These strategies may seem protective, but in reality, they keep you trapped in isolation where shame only grows stronger. The voice in your head thrives when you are disconnected, making you believe that your struggles make you different from everyone else. But the truth is, everyone hears that voice. It just takes courage to admit it. The dangerous part of shame is that it is quiet but relentless. Unlike guilt, which says, I did something wrong, shame says, I am something wrong. That shift in language makes all the difference. It becomes an identity instead of an action, wrapping itself around who you are instead of what you did. Because it is quiet, you rarely notice when it's shaping your choices. It influences how you show up at work, how you connect in relationships, and how you treat yourself when you fail. Over time, this whisper becomes a prison, limiting what you believe you deserve in life. Shame whispers most often in moments of vulnerability, when you step into new territory, when you dare to dream bigger, or when you risk rejection. It's that inner voice saying, who do you think you are? Just when you're trying to be brave. It thrives at the edge of growth because shame is terrified of courage. It wants you to stay small, invisible, and quiet so that you never realize your true strength. The whisper is not about truth, but about keeping you from discovering that you are capable of more than you've been told. The moment you understand this, you start to see shame for what it really is, a story, not a fact. That whisper is subtle, but it repeats often enough that it shapes your identity if left unchecked. You begin to internalize the belief that no matter what you achieve, it's never enough. The promotion doesn't silence it, the applause doesn't quiet it, and even love doesn't erase it. The voice finds new ways to remind you of your flaws and failures. But when you begin to listen closely, you realize that this voice does not belong to you. It is the accumulation of old wounds, past judgments, and the fear of disconnection. Understanding that shame is not your truth is the first step in silencing it. Even though shame whispers, you are not enough, the act of noticing it transforms its power. When you call it out, when you say to yourself, that's shame speaking, you create distance between who you are and what the voice says. Instead of living as if shame's words are your identity, you begin to see them as patterns that can be changed. The whisper becomes less threatening when you realize it is not the truth, but a story that can be rewritten. By becoming aware of it, you start to reclaim your voice, and that quiet whisper loses its grip on your heart. When shame is left unspoken, it grows quietly in the background of your life, feeding on your silence and fear. It lingers in your mind as a hidden voice that convinces you to hide even more. But the moment you name it, something powerful begins to shift. Saying out loud, "This is shame," creates distance between who you are and what you feel. Instead of being consumed by it, you start to recognize it as an experience rather than an identity. Naming shame is like turning on the light in a dark room. What once felt overwhelming and unmanageable becomes easier to face when you can see it clearly. By giving it a name, you take away the mystery that makes it so intimidating. Suddenly, it is no longer an invisible weight pressing on your chest. It becomes something you can examine and challenge. Naming does not erase the feeling, but it makes it less terrifying. Awareness is the first step toward freedom. When you identify shame, you disrupt its cycle of secrecy. Shame thrives on the belief that you must never let anyone know your struggles. But the act of naming breaks that silence, even if you only whisper it to yourself at first. By calling it out, you acknowledge that it exists, and this acknowledgement is powerful. It transforms shame from something hidden into something visible, and what is visible can be addressed. The courage to name it starts to weaken its hold. Naming shame also gives you language to share it with others. When you can say, "I feel ashamed," you invite empathy into the conversation. Empathy has the power to dissolve shame because it reminds you that you are not alone. Without words, shame isolates you in your private battles, but with words, you can connect with people who understand. Sharing what you feel does not make you weak. It makes you human. And humanity, not perfection, is what creates true belonging. The act of naming also separates you from the lie that shame is your identity. Instead of saying, "I am broken," you can say, "I am experiencing shame because I made a mistake." That shift is profound because it draws a clear line between who you are and what you feel. Shame wants to convince you that it defines you, but naming it exposes the truth. You are not shame. You are someone moving through a temporary experience. That distinction creates space for healing. When you name shame, you also reclaim your power to respond differently. Without awareness, shame drives your actions in subtle, destructive ways. It makes you hide, withdraw, or overcompensate without realizing why. But with awareness, you can pause and choose another response. You can remind yourself that feeling shame does not mean you are unworthy. The very act of noticing and naming gives you control where before you only felt powerless. Awareness shifts you from reacting to responding. Perhaps the most liberating part of naming shame is that it brings truth into the places where lies have lived. Shame whispers, "Don't let anyone know." But when you call it out, you are already resisting that command. It weakens because it can no longer hide in secrecy. You begin to realize that naming your shame is not just an act of awareness. It is an act of courage. It proves that you are stronger than the whispers that tried to silence you. And in that moment, shame's grip begins to loosen. Empathy is the one force strong enough to dismantle the hold that shame has on us. Shame tells you that if anyone knew your truth, they would reject you. But empathy answers with, "You are not alone." It is the act of someone listening without judgment, sitting with you in your pain and acknowledging your humanity. Empathy doesn't require fixing or offering solutions. It requires presence, and that presence is what makes shame lose its grip. When someone meets your shame with empathy, it interrupts the cycle of secrecy and isolation. Instead of hiding, you are seen. Instead of silence, your voice is heard. Shame thrives in darkness, but empathy shines light into the hidden places of your heart. The simple act of another person saying, "I understand, I felt that too," breaks the illusion that you are uniquely flawed. Suddenly, what once felt unbearable becomes lighter because you don't carry it alone. Empathy works because it speaks the exact opposite language of shame. Shame says you are unworthy. Empathy says you are valued. Shame says you are different. Empathy says you are human. Shame says no one could understand. Empathy says, may too. These opposing messages are why shame cannot survive when empathy is present. It is like water on fire. The more empathy you allow in, the smaller shame becomes until it burns out completely. True empathy does not dismiss or minimize your pain. It doesn't say it's not a big deal or you'll get over it. Instead, it leans in and acknowledges that what you feel is real and valid. This kind of acceptance builds trust, which shame cannot exist alongside. Trust creates the safety needed to tell your story without fear. And every time you tell your story to someone who responds with compassion, shame loses another piece of its power. Empathy is not only something others can offer you, it is also something you can learn to offer yourself. Speaking to yourself with kindness instead of harshness is a form of self-empathy. When you remind yourself that mistakes are part of being human, you stop fueling shame's lies. Self-empathy allows you to respond to your own pain with patience instead of criticism. This practice turns down the volume of shame's voice from within. The courage to seek empathy often feels risky because shame tells you to stay silent. It convinces you that vulnerability will only lead to judgment. But the truth is that vulnerability is the doorway to empathy. When you take the risk of sharing your story with the right person, you give them the opportunity to meet you with compassion. This exchange of openness creates connection, and connection is what shame fears most. It cannot survive where there is belonging. What makes empathy powerful is that it restores perspective. Shame narrows your vision, making you believe that your mistake or imperfection defines your entire identity. But when someone offers empathy, they remind you of the bigger picture. You are more than your flaws. You are a whole, imperfect, worthy human being who deserves love and acceptance. That reminder creates a shift inside you, replacing shame's lie with the truth of your inherent worthiness. You are not your shame, even though it often disguises itself as your identity. Shame tells you that because you failed, you are a failure, or because you made a mistake, you are the mistake. This merging of self and experience is how shame tightens its grip. It convinces you that your worth is permanently tied to what went wrong in your life. But the truth is that your mistakes are moments, not definitions of who you are. When you begin to separate your identity from your experiences, you start to see that shame has been lying all along. You are not the rejection, the heartbreak, or the poor choice that you made. You are the person who lived through it, who learned from it, and who carries the strength of survival. This shift matters because it frees you from carrying shame as a permanent label. You are a living, growing human being, not the sum of your worst moments. Shame thrives when you internalize it, when you adopt its voice as your own. It becomes the filter through which you judge yourself, making you believe you are unworthy of love and belonging. But the moment you say, "I am not my shame," you weaken that filter. You begin to reclaim your identity from the false narrative shame has built. Your essence, your worth, and your value are far greater than the lies shame wants you to believe. It helps to remember that everyone has flaws, failures, and regrets, yet those do not define their humanity. You would never reduce someone you care about to their worst mistake. So why should you do it to yourself? To believe you are only your shame is to ignore your resilience, your courage, and your capacity to grow. Seeing yourself in wholeness means holding both your light and your shadows together. That balance is where healing begins. You are not your shame because shame cannot capture the full story of your life. It only focuses on the parts it can distort, repeating them until you believe they are the whole truth. But if you step back, you can see the richness of your journey, the lessons learned, the love given, the dreams pursued. Those are just as real as the moments of failure or regret. Shame wants to erase the full picture, but you have the power to restore it. The danger of believing you are your shame is that it limits what you believe is possible for your future. If you think shame defines you, then every opportunity, relationship, or dream will feel out of reach. But when you realize shame is only an emotion and not your identity, you open the door to possibility again. You can take risks, show up authentically, and trust that your worth is not on trial. Freedom comes from knowing that your past does not dictate your future. When you separate yourself from shame, you reclaim your ability to grow. Mistakes become teachers instead of prisons. Failures become stepping stones rather than final verdicts. You recognize that shame may visit, but it does not belong to you. It is an emotion passing through, not a permanent resident in your identity. By reminding yourself that you are not your shame, you take back the narrative and choose truth over distortion. Replacing shame with self-compassion begins with the way you speak to yourself in moments of struggle. Shame tells you that you are not worthy, that you must be perfect to belong, and that mistakes erase your value. Self-compassion interrupts that narrative by offering kindness instead of criticism. It allows you to acknowledge your pain without judging yourself for it. This shift in language is the foundation for silencing shame's lies. When you practice self-compassion, you treat yourself the way you would treat a dear friend who is suffering. You would not tell a friend that they are worthless because they made a mistake. So why say it to yourself? Self-compassion asks you to extend the same grace inward that you so freely give outward. It creates space for healing because it replaces judgment with acceptance. In that acceptance, shame has no room to grow. Self-compassion also reminds you that imperfection is part of the human experience. Shame thrives on the illusion that everyone else has it figured out and you are the only one failing. But compassion reminds you that everyone struggles, everyone makes mistakes, and everyone feels inadequate at times. This shared humanity softens the isolation that shame creates. Instead of seeing yourself as broken, you begin to see yourself as human. Replacing shame with self-compassion does not mean ignoring responsibility. It means separating who you are from what you did. You can acknowledge a mistake, learn from it, and make amends without condemning yourself as unworthy. Shame says you are defined by the worst thing you've done, but compassion says you are more than your mistakes. This balance of accountability and kindness creates true growth. Without compassion, accountability becomes punishment rather than learning. The practice of self-compassion also requires mindfulness. Shame pulls you into the past, replaying regrets, or into the future, fearing judgment. Compassion keeps you grounded in the present, where you can simply acknowledge, this hurts, but I am here for myself. Mindfulness stops you from spiraling into shame stories and keeps you rooted in truth. It is the gentle pause that allows you to respond rather than react. In that pause, compassion finds its voice. Self-compassion is not weakness, it is strength. It takes courage to resist the harsh voice of shame and replace it with one of gentleness. Many people believe that being hard on themselves will push them to improve, but in reality, shame paralyzes while compassion motivates. When you encourage yourself with kindness, you build resilience to try again. Compassion gives you the courage to rise after falling, while shame only keeps you on the ground. Replacing shame with self-compassion transforms your inner world into a place of safety rather than judgment. When you know that you can face yourself with kindness, you no longer fear vulnerability. You can admit mistakes, speak your truth, and take risks without the constant fear of self-condemnation. Compassion creates freedom because it assures you that no matter what happens, you are still worthy of love. And in that assurance, shame loses its power. Courage silences shame because it allows you to confront the very voice that tries to keep you hidden. Shame thrives on fear, convincing you that if you show your true self, you will be rejected. Courage interrupts that story by saying, I will be seen anyway. When you choose courage, you expose the lies shame whispers in the dark. By stepping into the light, you weaken its grip on your heart. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Shame feeds on hesitation, hoping you will stay small and silent. But courage takes a step forward, even when the voice of doubt is loud. Each brave choice chips away at shame's power because it proves that you are more than the fears that hold you back. Courage transforms fear into fuel for growth. It reminds you that vulnerability is strength, not weakness. When you speak your truth, courage stands between you and shame's attempts to silence you. Shame tells you to hide your flaws, but courage says, "This is who I am." That honesty creates connection, and connection is where shame cannot survive. By being open about your struggles, you invite others to see their own humanity reflected in you. Courage does not just free you. It frees others by showing them they are not alone. Courage silences shame because it breaks the cycle of perfectionism. Shame demands flawless performance, whispering that any mistake makes you unworthy. Courage says mistakes are part of growth and not a measure of value. Choosing courage means daring to fail, daring to be imperfect, and daring to keep trying anyway. It's in those imperfect attempts that resilience is built. Courage gives you permission to show up as you are. The act of courage also changes your relationship with vulnerability. Instead of seeing it as exposure, you begin to see it as authenticity. Vulnerability is where courage and connection meet, and it is also where shame loses its strongest weapon. Shame tries to convince you that vulnerability is dangerous, but courage proves it is the path to belonging. Each time you choose openness, you build a shield against shame's lies. Courage transforms vulnerability into empowerment. Courage silences shame by rewriting the inner dialogue. Where shame says, "You can't," courage answers, "I will try." Where shame says, "You are not enough," courage replies, "I am worthy as I am." This internal shift may seem small, but repeated acts of courage build a new narrative. Over time, the voice of shame grows weaker because it is constantly challenged by the truth of your actions. Courage creates evidence that disproves shame's lies. Perhaps the greatest power of courage is that it creates freedom. Shame wants to trap you in silence, perfectionism, and fear of rejection. But courage opens doors to authenticity, connection, and growth. It reminds you that you do not have to be defined by mistakes or haunted by insecurity. Each courageous step proves that shame is not stronger than your will to rise. And with every act of bravery, the whispers of shame fade into the background.